And joining us now to discuss the government's latest plan for processing asylum seekers is the opposition immigration spokesman Scott Morrison, who's in our Parliament House studio. Scott Morrison, welcome to Late Line.
Good evening, Ali.
You said you won't support the government's legislative changes. You're happy for offshore processing to effectively be knocked on the head?
Offshore processing hasn't occurred under this government, Ali. I don't know how it stops when it hasn't started, but we're looking to support this bill with one simple amendment that would do two things. One, it would guarantee protections by ensuring that any country people were sent to was a signatory to the Refugee Convention. And secondly, by having such a condition, that would make an unchallengeable test, something that the courts could not override because it would be a simple question. They either have ratified that convention or they have not. And David Bennett, QC, has given us advice to this effect, that that is the best amendment to ensure that both the protections, which have been part of our policy for a decade, together with the discretion that is necessary going forward, is the best way to achieve these outcomes. Now, the Minister has come back in a fit of rage this afternoon, within an hour of us even putting these proposals up. I would have thought he might have wanted to consult with his Cabinet or even his caucus. He's chosen to do neither and just basically chuck a hissy fit.
You say that your amendments are uncontestable if it's a question of having to sign up to the convention, but in fact David Bennett, in his legal advice to you, he does point out that there could be room for debate if a country has signed up to the convention but with reservations. And indeed, Papua New Guinea, for example, has signed up with reservations. Sure,
but if the test which we put in the Act is simply that the Parliament is saying that the test for protections is whether someone has signed up to the convention or its protocol, then that is a simple test which is not open to interpretation. They either have or they haven't.
But doesn't necessarily mean that rights are protected.
But what it means is they've signed a convention, and in particular Article 33, which is the guaranteed right to non-refoulement. Now, what the government has put forward in their proposal today is for the Minister to consider these things but not necessarily be bound by them. I mean, he could form whatever view he wants. And it's important to understand here, Ali, that we're not just talking about what our government might do if we're elected or what this government might do if elected. We're talking about what any government might do in the future. We're looking to change the Act here for all time until it may be changed again in the future. So I think we have to be careful not to confine our debates too closely to just these two proposals.
But it's a fair question. It's a fair question to ask you why the UN Refugee Convention is now the gold standard for the coalition. It's never bothered you before.
Well, because after the High Court decision, it found that there needed to be an objective test if you wanted to continue to have discretion by the Minister. Now, we agree that there should be discretion, but that discretion shouldn't be a blank cheque. Not for this government, not for any government. And the best way to ensure, we believe, that there is a clear objective test as to how someone can assess whether there are protections in place is simply whether they've done the same thing Australia has done, and that is to have signed the Refugee Convention or Protocol. Now, there are 147 countries that they can choose from. It's hardly a major restraint. If they wanted to do the same arrangement with the Philippines or something of that nature, or even open the centre in PNG as they've proposed, they could do that. But the government, I think, got stuck on one point here for an obvious reason. We're happy to support this bill, Ali, but we want it with that amendment. And if they don't, then we're not prepared to support it.
You talk about the convention being an objective test as to whether there are protections in place, but you're still happy to tow boats back to countries which haven't signed up?
Well, that's not offshore processing. That's towing boats back.
But isn't in the end, isn't the result the same? The asylum seekers who were to arrive in this country end up in another country without the protections that you now consider to be important as defined under the UN Refugee Convention.
We think that convention signatory status is an important objective test for offshore processing. Turning back the boats is not offshore processing. We've never claimed we never claimed that at any time. Back 10 years ago, when we introduced those policies of turning boats back and offshore processing and temporary protection visas, all of these sat together as a suite of policies. Turning boats back is a direct, blunt deterrent. That is combined with offshore processing, which this government abolished and hasn't introduced. I mean, who have they processed offshore while they've been in government? And then thirdly, temporary protection visas and a suite of other things we've announced, from everything from the assessment process of people we believe have thrown their documentation away, which is more than 80% of cases. But if we believe they've done that on purpose, then we would decide against or presume against refugee status. So we have a suite of policies here to achieve our objective. The government has one policy.
Part of your suite of policies, as you say, is turning back the boats. And I have heard you talk about a different legal requirement because, in fact, it's not offshore processing and they wouldn't have entered Australian waters. But is this
Correct.
about Australia's legal requirement, or is it about the coalition trying to get better protections for asylum seekers? Because if it is the latter, then surely if you're turning back boats, the end result is the same.
We've had the same policy for a decade and we haven't shifted an inch in this current policy debate. We've consistently said turning boats back, which is one sphere of policy, offshore processing, which is another, and then temporary protection visas for those who are granted some form of refugee assessment in a positive way, so a positive RSA. So they're our three tiers, if you like, of border protection that we apply around this issue. We don't pretend that turning boats back is offshore processing. This government has not implemented offshore processing. But where you do have a system of offshore processing, then there are important legal arrangements that have to be respected, and we believe this is the best way to do it.
Final quick question. What about unaccompanied minors? Will you pass the government's proposed amendments to the Migration Guardianship of Children Act so the minister can have discretion in relation to decisions regarding minors?
Well, as we've said, we haven't proposed any amendments to that section.
So you would support that legislative change?
We haven't suggested any change because it's our view that what is done there is restores the previous legal understanding. But more generally, what the government has not done, which the minister said he would do, is restore the more general previous legal understanding of what occurred before the High Court decision. Now, the government's gone way beyond that, and the government now, I think, has a serious caucus management problem, and they'll have to deal with that in the morning. And I was very surprised that the minister was prepared to speak on all of caucus this afternoon within an hour of receiving our proposal. We will support this bill if they agree to this amendment.
And if they don't, that's it. There are no more compromises, no more amendments to the amendments.
Well, in our party room tonight, we agreed that if the government cannot support, refuses to support our amendment, then we won't support the bill. And we think that's a reasoned, consistent position to take because it reflects the view we've had for a decade. Now, if the government doesn't want to do that, well, that is their choice. But we are not the government. The government has an alliance partner that it relies on for its success in forming a government, and that's up to them.
All right, Scott Morrison, many thanks for talking to us tonight.
Thanks very much, Ali. Good to be with you.